listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this is the 7th of our partnership series with the European Research Network on Philanthropy, or ERNOP, where I talk to academics whose work has been featured in the latest release of ERNOP Research Notes, which are kind of short, practitioner-focused summaries of recent work that's come out in the academic field around philanthropy and civil society, to give you a sense of what's going on out there in the wide world of philanthropy academia. So we've got 3 mini-interviews with academics talking about kind of a wide variety of work that they've done. First up, we have Georg von Schnurbein. And now, Georg is the founding director of the Centre for Philanthropy Studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And he's talking about a paper that he co-authored with Berenike Wiener, and that's titled Foundation Investment Funds for Grant-Making Foundations in Germany. Do they facilitate sustainable investing? So this is looking at a particular kind of fund that has been made specially available for foundations and focusing on their investment in Germany and seeing what impact that's had, if any, on levels of sustainable investing among foundations. Next up after that, we have Joris Schröder. Joris is a PhD candidate at Vrije University in Amsterdam, who keen listeners will know we featured a number of people from before on the ERNOP episodes of the podcast, because obviously a hotbed of research around philanthropy. And Joris is talking about a paper that he co-authored with Eva Maria Mertz, Bianca Swanet and Pamela Wiebking, who again is a previous guest on the podcast. And that paper's titled, Did You Donate? Talking about donations predicts compliance with solicitations for donations. So it's about the impact that talking about donations and where solicitations for donations have come from on people's propensity to comply with requests to give, particularly in the context of blood donations. So it's an interesting one there. And then last but not least, we have Professor Georg Lindenmayer from the University of Freiburg. And Jörg was talking about a paper that he co-authored with Marcela Muller, and that's titled Exploring the Role of Charitable Ethnocentrism and Donation Motives in International Giving, Empirical Evidence from Germany. So we'll hear from each of those in a minute. I'll just kind of give you a short intro before each one so you know who I'm talking to, and then I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. So without further ado, let's hear from our interviewees. And first up, we have Georg von Schnurbein. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Georg von Schnurbein. Hi there, Georg.
Hello. Hi, Rodri.
Hi there. Well, it's great to have you on the podcast. Great to have a chance to talk. And obviously, we're here to talk about some work that you've got featured in the latest release of ERNOP Research Notes. And the paper in question is looking at foundations in Germany and their investments, and particularly at these things called foundation investment funds that exist in Germany. So maybe the best place to start is if you could sort of say a bit about what the research is about, how it came about, and what some of the key findings were.
Okay, thank you. So in Germany, we have a kind of a peculiar situation. So foundations can invest in everything. So they are quite open in the way what they want to invest in. But on the other hand, there's also a very restrictive regulation. So the preservation of the capital has a very high relevance. And that leads to a high risk aversity of the foundation boards, naturally, because if you fail, you have to step in with your private money. So, and that leads to a situation where foundations can do investments, and due to the developments on the financial markets, they have to be more risk-taking. So probably not only invest in obligations, but also in shares and something like that, and as a connection to shares, also in funds. But they want to do it with some security. And so fund providers found this as a kind of a market niche, and they come up with these kind of specific investment funds for foundations. And these are investment funds that are somehow investing into shares of companies, but at the same time have some security aspects in it. So you can never lose everything. And now we were specifically interested if these foundation investment funds, as they are directly oriented towards these charitable foundations, if they have probably more aspects of sustainability in it, because this is something you could have expected because it's for charitable foundations and they probably are also interested in aspects of sustainability. And that's how we started this research. And there are not too many of these foundation investment funds, so the total number is 52. And so we took them all and got some information. It took figures from MSCI on the development of these foundation investment funds. And then we did an analysis, which is called multi-dimensional scaling, which helps you to connect different types of information in one analysis and offers you a form of creating clusters. So finding differentiation. And in the end, we came up with 2 clusters. And then afterwards, you try to interpret the result. And so we gave the 2 clusters a name, and one cluster we called the distinct cluster. It contains funds that are rather small, are more local or national oriented, and are also probably more attracting smaller or mid-sized foundations as investors. And the other cluster, there were not too many funds in this cluster, we call the attached cluster, because this was often kind of a subgroup or a sub-fund of a larger fund, which was only just named in a type to be attractive for foundation. And these funds usually were larger, were more internationally, more diverse in their investment strategies. But altogether, for all the clusters and for all the investments, we can say that socially responsible investing aspects were not very well covered. And that was kind of disappointing for us also as researchers, because we kind of think this would be a good thing. So to say, as a final conclusion, we find that for foundations, it is not very helpful to use these foundation investment funds for their investment strategies. So they don't gain anything. It's rather more expensive than other funds. And so just choose a general fund would be much more effective. And for the fund providers, we suggest that they should, instead of just making some attached fund and call it a foundation investment fund, they should rather develop funds, for example, directed towards social issues or cultural issues or so, which would be interesting for foundations with this specific purpose. And then this probably could make a difference and also could be a more target-oriented strategy.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I know when I started reading the paper, my initial reaction was, this is, I didn't know that there were such things as foundation investment funds. How exciting. And this is, it seems like a really kind of positive development. And I got to the end and obviously say the finding there is that actually it's more about meeting the kind of minimal requirements on accountability and risk profile rather than the social aspect of things is disappointing. I guess just one practical question is, how long have these kinds of specialized funds been around in Germany? Is it a relatively recent development or has they been there for a little while now?
They're not too old because I would say probably 15 years, probably the oldest 20 years, because before that, the investment strategies for foundations were even more restricted. So they probably only would take loans and or did borrowing, but they would not invest into the financial markets due to the regulation. And this has improved after a new legal regulation in 2004, I think. And then afterwards, slowly, this kind of developed also these offers.
I wanted to ask on that question around the regulation and particularly the sort of barriers to foundations adopting an approach which is based on, at the very least, kind of socially responsible investment or screening or having ethical principles and, at the further end, maybe kind of mission-related investment. Is it the case at the moment that there are still actual technical legal barriers or practical barriers in the way of foundations doing that in Germany? Or is it more the case that it's a problem of perception and that people involved in foundations feel as though their responsibility is to invest in kind of mainstream funds?
I think it's difficult to talk for all the foundations, so there might be different cases. But in general, I would rather say it's the latter. So it's more a question of perception. It's also a question of people involved. Yeah. So many of the foundation board members are doing this work voluntarily, and they are not experts in financial markets, and so they are really risk averse. And also, if you do it voluntarily, you don't want to get into trouble with the authorities and so on. So you are rather conservative in doing that what you have always done, because you know that's okay. And also, I think there has to be a change in perception also on the side of the authorities, because they don't force or motivate foundations to invest in more, let's say, sustainable or even impact investings, because for them it's also more work. Mm. So they rather want to have the foundations be invested very conservatively, and because then for them they know what to do. So I think it's on both ends. There are limitations in knowledge. There are limitations in attitudes, which are more the problem than the legal regulation, because basically you can do it, but you have to take the risk.
Yeah, which would certainly echo, because that is very much the situation in the UK. I mean, there are barriers, but they're not as significant as I think a lot of foundation trustees think they are, and actually it's partly about making people aware of that. And you say please do.
I might add, sorry. I also think the financial market has developed a lot during the past 5 years. So our data is probably not. It's always with the scientific publications until they are out. It takes some time, but so there has been some development, and I really hope that it gets even more attractive to invest in these kinds of.
And I just had two other quick questions on that before I want to sort of zoom out and ask a bit more about the sort of wider context. One was, you mentioned in the paper and just at the start when we were talking there, that there is kind of a wider awareness and a debate about foundation assets and endowments. And I think an acknowledgement that grant making is only ever a small part of the potential of what foundations can do. So if we ignore this much larger potential bit, we're missing something. Is that debate relatively well advanced in Germany? And I guess, is there any pressure coming on foundations, either from their grantees or sort of civil society organizations, or from the public, to think more about investing in ways that are aligned with their missions?
I would say the debate is still very much on the level of experts and the bubble, kind of the foundation bubble, that it's happening, because from the perspective of beneficiaries, if you tell them, well, yes, we can do that, but probably then we have less to spend, then they probably won't be so happy about that. So it's there's the pros and cons are difficult for them, but generally I think there is some movement towards more impact investing, also among foundations in Germany as well as here in Switzerland. More and more foundations are thinking about what they can do, and there just has been released a report on investment strategies of Swiss foundations, where 75% of the foundations say they follow at least some aspects of sustainable investing. So I think this has become mainstream now. Yes.
And I guess the final question on it was, at that further end of the spectrum, where you have foundations that are thinking beyond something as straightforward as screening towards actually using their assets to invest in line with their mission. Is there much of that going on within the samples that you looked at? Or was it something that kind of was left out almost as a result of the fact that they wouldn't be investing in these kinds of funds anyway?
So in our study, we only looked at the investment fund. So we didn't look at the specific foundation, because as in Germany, as in Switzerland, there is no publication obligation. So we don't know how the foundations invest. I would say for the larger part of the foundation world in both countries, they don't think about these kinds of investments in terms of impact investing or more direction of private equity and things like that. Also because they lack the knowledge, they lack the risk, and so on. So I think that's a small part, but nevertheless, I still convinced that this could be an interesting part, because if some larger foundations really take on these aspects, and we have examples in Switzerland of foundations that really go this direction, they can be kind of path makers for others and beyond the foundation sector. So, for example, for pension funds, this is one aspect that is often overseen, that there are some similarities between the two types of investors, but the pension funds are usually also not very risk taking. So if they kind of can learn and see how these cases can be approached, and realize that could have a higher impact.
And as some people often point out, if you manage to affect even a tiny change in the way that pension funds invest, the effect of that would be significantly larger than even the biggest foundation. So that's really interesting. I just wanted to finish on the paper bite. You mentioned it in passing, but just to ask a bit about, from your point of view, what you think the benefits or the insights, particularly for practitioners or policymakers, are of this work, because obviously one of the things that the ERNOP series is intended to do is to try and bring this kind of research more to the attention of practitioners.
Yeah. So I hope first that foundation board members become more aware of their investment strategies and really think about these kinds of investments and what they can do. And I think even if you're risk averse, you still can do a lot and you can make a difference for your own investments. And second, I also hope that fund providers, so banks or other investment companies, probably also become more aware of this target group or target group of foundations and what their needs are, and that they are not just another type or a single a subgroup of something, but that they have specific needs and that you should address these specific needs. Or if not, then just leave it. And for politics, I think it's not so much for politics in there, for policymakers. But generally, I think for policymakers, it's important that they understand that foundations need some, is either you allow them to be more risk-taking, and then they can do things. Also in this larger debate about philanthropy and the role of philanthropy in society, if we want to say or allow foundations to be more risk-taking, we also have to allow them to fail.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the moment, the law doesn't, in Germany at least, doesn't allow foundations to fail. And so they don't take risks. And you cannot expect foundations to become innovative if you don't allow them to fail. So that's, I think, these are sides of one coin. And this is something that I would be happy if this would become more publicly viewed.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think it relates it to some of those wider debates. I guess I just wanted to zoom out and ask kind of about the broader question of, in general, what's your perception of the links between academia and practice when it comes to philanthropy? I mean, do you find that it's easy to get input for your research from practice? And conversely, do you find it easy to sort of disseminate the findings of what you're doing to practitioners? Or do you think there are kind of barriers in the way?
I mean, I do empiric research, so I always lack data. I would be very happy to have more data on philanthropic organizations and philanthropy in general. I mean, that's a huge issue. So my call for transparency in philanthropy is not totally unselfish. But beyond that, I think the exchange with foundation and or representatives of philanthropic organizations in general is very good for us. So we have good access to these kind of organizations, and in terms of case studies and additional material and so on, I think this works very well. And there is a high interest also in the sector, at least here for Switzerland, I can say that, to also learn and to improve. But as I said, for doing decent research compared also, for example, to the UK or the US, we would need much better data foundations.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just finally, because you mentioned before, one of the things about academic work, and I guess that proves a barrier sometimes in the relationship with practice, is the timescales are often a lot longer. And I know with these research notes, they often relate to research and papers that were done a number of years ago. So I just wanted to ask what it is that you're working on now, whether it's anything that sort of builds on this work or whether there are other areas that you're working on at the moment.
So one topic I'm working on now is something totally different, and we call it nanophilanthropy. So it's all these micro, tiny pieces of cyber volunteering, clicktivism, small donations at the cashier in your supermarket, roundup, things like that. Where we are interested in understanding whether this has a crowding in or crowding out on philanthropy in general. If it has a crowding in effect, it would be great, because then we probably can attract more people to engage in philanthropy in whatever kind of donations, volunteering, whatever. If it has a crowding out effect, that would cause probably a reduction of philanthropic capital in the future, and that would be not so good. So then we would have to think about how we can attract these people or keep these people attached to philanthropy. And so that's something we are looking into at the moment, and where we want to do some experiments in order to better understand the relations.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. I think a really, really important question, as you say, at the moment, and certainly for the future. So I'll look forward to hearing more about that. Just remains to say thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's great to hear about your work, and hopefully we'll get a chance to catch up again before too long.
Yeah, and thank you for your work as well, and thank you for inviting me. It was great. Thank you.
Great. So next we're going to hear from Joris Schröder about his work looking at the impact of talking about donations on people's likelihood to comply with solicitations. So let's hear from Joris. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Joris Schröder. Hi there, Joris.
Hi there.
Well, great to have you on the podcast. And we're here to talk about some research and a paper that you have featured in the most recent release of the ERNOP Research Notes series. Probably the best place to start, if you could just tell us a bit about what the research in question was about and what some of the key things that you found in the paper were.
Yeah. So the basic question of the paper is pretty simple. And the question is, so if people get requests for donations, how is their decision about whether to comply with these requests related to social influences, for example, being recruited by word of mouth, so by other people basically, and by the extent to which they generally talk about donations with other people. And the headline finding is basically that donors that talk about donations also have much higher compliance rates with these solicitations for donations. Yeah, maybe I can say a little bit more about the background of the project and then get back to the findings.
That would be great, because I know the project itself and the particular context is around blood donation. So maybe you could say a bit about how that came about and how the research was done.
Yeah, so this paper is really part of a larger project that is also funded by the European Research Council and led by my PhD thesis supervisor, Eva Maria Merz, which really aims to understand blood donation behavior. And we think this is a form of giving that can also teach us a lot about human cooperation and pro-social behavior in general. And this paper is part of that effort that kind of tries to understand some of the social network aspects and the social influences that are at work for blood donation behavior. And the basic premise for this paper then was to not look at giving as kind of a spontaneous thing, but to acknowledge that it's highly institutionalized and that many donations are actually made in response to these solicitations for donations. So I think most of the listeners have probably received such requests via either email or letters or on the street, or in the Netherlands, we have door-to-door collections, which are quite common. So there's many forms in which you might receive such requests. And they're really a common tool a tool that is really commonly used by organizations. And we really want wanted to understand better how social influences operate to influence these decisions about compliance or not. So what we study is basically communication, being recruited by somebody else, and also talking about donations, because communication has been really shown to be effective in more experimental studies of pro-social behavior, but not so far in kind of more real-world manifestations of pro-social behavior, such as blood donation and also charitable giving or volunteering.
You mentioned there, I think there's an important distinction in the paper, isn't there, between sort of word of mouth solicitation, so those that come directly from people that you know, or kind of another human being, they might be a stranger, or they might be someone that you have a previous acquaintance with, and just the wider context of having talked about donations or, blood donation specifically. Did you have different findings according to how relevant both of those things were as factors?
Okay, so the two things that we look at is, first of all, being recruited via word of mouth, which is being recruited by just another person as compared to being recruited via blood bank recruitment materials, so brochures or social media or some online information. And the other thing is whether a donor just generally talks about donations with people in their social network. And yeah, you're right there. There are some differences in what we find. So I already mentioned the headline findings. So talking about donations seems to be really relevant. So if we compare people that never really talk about donations to those that somewhat regularly talk about donation, we see that there's about a 5 percentage point difference in their compliance rate, which we think is quite substantial, over an average of about 50% compliance in this case. And then for being recruited via word of mouth, we don't really find any differences between donors that were recruited via word of mouth and those that were recruited via other channels. We weren't really able to track down the explanation of why that might not work like we thought it would work. So why there's not this embedding in a social network that comes with being recruited via word of mouth, which then increases your compliance rate. But our hypothesis is that being recruited via word of mouth is just, for many donors, quite far in the past. So being initially recruited could have happened 5 or 10 years ago, and that doesn't necessarily tell us much about the current state of your social network, as opposed to talking about donations, which measures their kind of embedding at that point in time, and which also seems to matter much more.
Okay, yeah. And with thinking about that, the impact of sort of talking about donations, did you get any sense within the research about what the causal mechanism was that meant that it had that positive impact? I mean, because you could guess, it's either potentially a sort of upward thing about it being something that encourages people to do it if they hear other people talking about it, or it could be the opposite. It's that people are worried that that there will be subject to sort of peer pressure or that censure if they don't do it. Did you get a sense of which of those it was?
Empirically, we don't really get a better understanding of which of these mechanisms it might be. But I think you mentioned two important ones, and there are many that could be at work here. So one is, for example, that it just reveals information about need. So if you hear from other people that they donate, then you might think, okay, this is something that I should probably also do. Maybe they tell you that it's really important. It also conveys norms and expectation about behavior. So social norms, maybe they can be perceived negatively, as you described it. If there's social pressure, that might also end up not working so well. But generally, norms can also positively affect behavior. It might also just increase your feeling of connectedness with the blood donor community and foster blood donor identity. So there's many mechanisms that we weren't really able to test with this study, and that we're hopefully also going to be able to test in future studies.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting to see if that has an impact. And I wondered as well, in terms of talking, whether it's possible to dig into the question of whether it's just talking in the broad sense that has the impact, or whether it makes a difference who specifically they're talking about these things with. Is it that if it's close family or existing acquaintances, as opposed to sort of less strong acquaintances, that has a different scale of effect?
Yeah, I mean, from this study, again, we don't really have the information to to give a lot of detail about who they're talking to. We just have basically the extent of talking. But what we know from some other studies in general is that social proximity really matters for social influences. So the closer the people that you're socially influenced by, usually, typically, the stronger the social influence. And from another study that we've also conducted in the Netherlands, we also looked at more direct social contagion. So kind of how does it affect your behavior if people in your social surroundings also donate blood? And what we found there is that the neighborhood in itself seems to matter, but to a fairly small degree. And it seems to matter because basically the people that you live with and your partners particularly, those are really strong influences on your behavior. And that's also in line with social proximity finding in general. And I think it would be similar for talking about donations, but we don't really have the information in this paper to say anything about that.
Yeah. And the other thing that I want to ask, you mentioned before about this being in the particular context of blood donations, but, sort of generally being thought that then has relevance, sort of wider findings about altruistic behavior and charitable giving. I wondered, you mentioned in the paper a couple of potential places where there are things that are specific to the context of blood donations, like the fact that blood is a commodity with a short shelf life, presumably sort of unlike money. Maybe there are sort of psychological difference because the nature of the sacrifice being made. Where do you think there are kind of contextual factors that we need to be aware of that might be more specific to blood donations and maybe not quite as directly applicable?
I mean, one of the obvious big differences that you already got at a little bit is that blood donation is a health behavior. So we have many different considerations that are at play here that are not really at play with volunteering or charitable giving to that extent. So, for example, many people are just not eligible to donate blood based on health restrictions. So it can be either based on age, on weight, or their hemoglobin levels, and also the perceived costs of donating. So the inconveniences are, of course, not distributed evenly across people. For some, it's just a minor inconvenience, and for some, it can be really unpleasant. And also the other thing that you mentioned, that more blood is not always better in this case, because we kind of need a constant flow, so to say, of blood donations because they have a fairly limited shelf life. So I think there are definitely interesting differences in between like blood donation and volunteering and charitable giving, which I think are the three most commonly studied institutionalized forms of pro-social behavior. And there have been some studies that dig into these differences. So I remember that specifically in the context of social influences, it seems that volunteering might be more strongly influenced than, for example, blood donation or pro-social or blood donation, because volunteering is kind of the most public out of these behaviors. So that could be, that seems to be suggested by prior research. And on the other hand, it seems that familiar influences, for example, are more important for blood donation. So if somebody in your family is already a blood donor, that seems to transmit more so for blood donation than for other forms of volunteering. But I think that's an area that's, where not a lot of research has been done. And I also think that even within these big buckets of blood donation, charitable giving, and volunteering, there are such big differences within these behaviors that I'm not super sure how useful it would even be to even get at the differences between charitable giving and blood donation in general. For example, because for blood donation, there are so many different systems. In Europe, it's largely voluntary and non-remunerated, but there are also countries where it's paid, which of course is another dimension that motivates people. And then there are systems where people are kind of reciprocating the donations of other people that have received the donations. And already there we can see there's so many different things at work that I'm not sure that comparing just between these broad buckets of behavior is really most useful. But
it's really interesting. I never thought of that actually there are within each of those supposedly clear fields, actually there's so many differences that it's probably not that helpful. I just wanted to ask, assuming that you can get some lessons from these contexts that read across to the other contexts, what in your view are the kind of the insights that this research can offer for practitioners particularly? Because I guess the focus of these ERNOP papers is sort of bringing the research findings to practitioners.
I think so. One of the main things that I think Andrea Giosin, who from Salesforce, who wrote this ERNOP Research Notes, what she took away was also the headline finding. So communication is important, and also particularly for novice donors. So what we also found in the paper is that it seems to be more influential for novice blood donors who've not made that many donations because they have not yet formed a habit of donating likely. So I think the key insight was really, like, let's say, well received and potentially also somewhat already known in the world of practitioners, because she also mentioned that this is something that many organizations also do. And we know from blood banks that some organizations use patient stories and donor stories to kind of communicate the behavior of others. And so I think generally interventions that go in the direction of communicating more about the pro-social behavior, those are really straightforward. Another, to me, interesting suggestion from Andrea was that she suggested to particularly make use of generative AI now to make it really easy for donors to share their donation experiences online. So this is not really something that's directly connected to the findings of the paper, because we don't really say anything about the specific intervention. But I think it's interesting to see what kind of ideas the results inspire. And I also hope that we get to test some of these interventions that people come up with in collaboration between practice and academia in the future.
Yeah, it'd be absolutely fascinating. And just on that, to sort of zoom out a bit, what's your sense, based on your experience so far, of what the links are like between practice and academia and philanthropy? Do you think that actually it's relatively easy for academics to engage with practitioners when they're doing research? And conversely, when you're trying to convey research findings, do you find it easy to get an audience for them?
So I think I can mostly talk about my experience, like from the field of blood donation, where you have many also different actors. You have the researchers and then blood banks. Sometimes those are national institutions. Sometimes there's many different institutions within one country. And in that field, I think there's still a lot of unused potential for collaboration. So we do see, for example, in the Netherlands, we have this really unique arrangement where the blood bank itself has a research facility where we do research that tries to explain how blood donation behavior works, try to find out what might work. But then still within the organization, it's sometimes difficult to translate from, okay, we found this, to this is what the communication department then does, or what the marketing department does. And in the other direction as well, we don't really know all too well what they're thinking about implementing and whether that might work or not. So there's still a lot of room for collaboration. And I think that's also true more generally in the field. We actually did a workshop at a conference last year, one of the conferences that brings together practitioners and researchers, specifically on this topic, where we asked people, so what are the challenges to collaboration between practitioners and researchers? And I think the most common challenges that were voiced is just not clear communication, so lack of clear communication, and maybe the use of jargon that makes it difficult to collaborate sometimes. Also lack of shared goals and an understanding of shared goals, because I do think, particularly in blood donation, we have really aligned kind of goals and incentives. We all want to try to kind of improve blood collection, have happy and healthy donors, and a sufficient blood supply and safe blood supply. And we're all working towards that goal, but there's many challenges also just related to time and resource constraints on both sides again, and then IT challenges and so forth. So there's many things that can be challenging, but I also think that at that workshop, for example, we noticed a lot of enthusiasm because there is recognition of these shared goals, and there are some ways that people think about how to potentially improve that. So, for example, just more collaboration where each side is involved from the start, because we sometimes have it that then one party jumps in halfway through the process and then it's not not really a good way of doing research or doing practice, and doesn't really go anywhere, and clarifying mutual expectations and responsibilities and the goals of collaboration. So I think these can be really important steps to improve collaboration between practice and research.
Yeah, great. And I think things that we've heard from many other people who've come on the podcast as part of this ERNOP series. And just finally, I wanted to ask what it is that you're working on at the moment, because obviously I know sometimes the work that's featured in these research notes has actually been done a few years before, given the time lags in academia. You mentioned that you're involved in sort of a wider project around blood donations. Mm-hmm. Is it still mostly that you're working on, or are there other areas that you're involved in as well?
So at the moment, it's mostly that. So one of the things that we've been working on following up on this paper actually is to try to figure out what strategies might be that work to make use of these social mechanisms in the field. So more specifically, one intervention that we have been working on evaluating is a group membership program that the Australian Red Cross Lifeblood, so the Australian Blood Bank, has implemented for quite some time now, where donors can form groups together with other donors and then sign up as a team and also donate together and communicate about it and also make it more fun, hopefully, for them as a process. That also seems to be really effective. So we think that could be one way for blood banks to make use of these social interactive mechanisms that we have identified, for example, in this paper. And then in the future, we also want to get more at the mechanisms basically behind this. You already hinted at them in the beginning. So it could be shared identity, or it could be just knowledge about need or others' behavior, which kind of triggers the effectiveness of these social influences. So that's also something that we want to find out in the future, hopefully also through field experiments in collaboration with organizations active in the field.
Great. It all sounds fascinating. We're really interested to see what the findings that come out of that research are. Just remains to say, Joris, thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's great to hear about the work you've been doing. And look forward to hearing more in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and now we're going to hear from Georg Lindenmayer about the paper that he co-authored on charitable ethnocentrism and the impact that it has on international donations. So let's hear from Georg. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Georg Lindenmayer. It's great to have you on the podcast. And we're here to talk about a paper that you have featured in the latest ERNOP Research Notes series. So maybe the best place to start is if you could tell people listening what the research in question is about and what some of the key findings in the paper were.
The paper is about charitable ethnocentrism, which is a concept that is based on a concept from consumer behavior research, which is called consumer ethnocentrism. This consumer ethnocentrism construct is looking at the beliefs of consumers that purchasing domestic goods is morally superior to buying foreign-made goods, and that, for example, German consumers, according to this concept, are more or should be more loyal to German companies, or UK consumers should be more loyal to UK companies. We wondered whether we could use this concept, or the idea behind that concept, to explain donations to causes abroad. Then we looked at literature and we saw that other authors, colleagues, have already published a paper and introduced a construct called charitable ethnocentrism to the literature. And one of these authors is Hart, and he has published a paper in Voluntas, and we connect to this paper. And we did a survey study, and we tried to explain the inclination of German donors to donate to causes abroad, and we try to explain whether and how ethnocentrism impacts this inclination or the willingness to donate to causes abroad. One main result of the study is that this charitable ethnocentrism construct has a negative effect on the donation inclination of the respondents in our study.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the research survey itself, how exactly did you determine the degree of ethnocentrism of the participants involved? What was the framing that got you some measure of that?
Yes, here we've referred to Shimp and Sharma. They developed a measurement scale for this consumer ethnocentrism construct called SET scale. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. And we adopted this scale also based on the previous work of Hart in Voluntas, and then we measured this charitable ethnocentrism with 3 question items in the questionnaire based on rating scales. It's an approach which practitioners can also easily apply if they want to. That's the way we measured it in our survey. Yes.
Absolutely. And I wondered, because in the paper you talk quite a bit about the relationship between this idea of charitable ethnocentrism and the idea of in-group membership and out-group membership and how that influences people giving. Do the findings in the paper sort of back up the idea that empathy by itself is perhaps not a good basis for expecting people to give equitably to those in out groups, and that actually there's a tendency for many people to look within their own in group first?
First of all, when we look at the mean value of this charitable ethnocentrism, which was measured on a 7-point scale, we see that the mean value is 2.72. So this charitable ethnocentrism, when we look at all of the respondents in our survey, is not very pronounced, but definitely there is some variance in this variable. So probably there are a lot of German donors who are not ethnocentristic, but there's also quite a group of potential donors who hold this belief, and that's the first thing that we have to keep in mind. And then, with regard to your question to empathy, I believe empathy still is a driver of the donation intention of these ethnocentristic donors. When we look at probably you know this hypothesis or the theory, the empathy or altruism hypothesis. When we look at this theory or hypothesis, we see that empathy is important to motivate donors to donate in cases when there are high costs of donating or helping. So we can classify this ethnocentristic tendency as a cost, and we can, if these ethnocentristic donors, when they feel empathy for the people abroad and they have a pronounced level of empathy, then I believe that this can diminish the effects of ethnocentrism among these donors.
That's interesting. And because I had wondered, actually, one question I had was about whether when there are in-group relationships which actually go across national borders because people are members of religious groups or diaspora communities, how that interacted. I guess maybe they're two separate groupings, but are those, in terms of identifying potential donors, are those the sorts of things that non-profits and fundraisers would need to be able to identify to understand how people might be inclined to give in an international context?
Well, our sample size was rather low, some 100 respondents, so we did not look into this topic more precisely. There are some research, I'm not so into it, for example, that looks at whether American Jews give to causes in Israel, for example. I saw a paper yesterday before our interview that stated that these donations declined, but it's a paper from 2001, I believe. Especially the donations to umbrella organizations declined, and then there are some papers that show that American Jews also give to Arab NGOs in Israel. So that has changed a little bit. But I believe that, of course, when there's a natural disaster in a country in the global south, the migrants here in Germany, UK, or in the US, for example, they have a very high motivation to donate and to help their relatives and friends in their country of origin. Yes.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to ask, obviously the particular focus of the research note series from ERNOP is about connecting academia and academic findings to practitioners. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of what the kind of key insights that your paper can offer for practitioners in particular?
Okay, for practitioners, I believe that a segmentation strategy could be interesting. So, like in consumer goods markets, the market for donations, or the donor market, can be separated. For example, we could do further research and see, okay, is there a large ethnocentric donor market segment? Is there a segment of donors which holds very low ethnocentric beliefs, and how can I describe these segments? For example, in terms of gender, age, income, educational achievements, etc. And then when I have different causes, maybe causes, domestic causes and causes abroad, I could try to target these different donor segments. For example, if I have an important cause in which where the problem lies abroad, then I can target the low ethnocentrism segment and put my fundraising budget there, and the other way around. So that's a recommendation for practitioners in NGOs and nonprofit organizations. I can also give recommendations for policymakers. When politicians see that there is a high ethnocentric tendency in their country, or regarding a specific cause abroad, then they could try to shift development aid programs. So when they see, okay, there are low donations from the private sectors, from the general public, then they should shift money in development programs to this causes abroad. Of course, they have to pay attention to public acceptance of these measures. No?
Yeah, interesting. And I just want to ask sort of more broadly on that, what your sense is of the current state of links between academia and practice in philanthropy. Do you find it easy to engage with practitioners when doing research, and conversely, when you're trying to disseminate findings, do you find it easy to get those to a practitioner audience?
Short answer, no. And we have to work on this topic hardly. It's very important to work on this problem. So I really like these research notes from ERNOP, because it's a vehicle to transfer the empirical evidence from the academia to the practitioners. It's very important, and I really like these research notes in the series.
Great. And I just wanted to ask finally, obviously often the work that's been done that's featured in the research notes is actually done a few years ago, and because of academic timescales. So what is it that you're focusing on in your work particularly now? Is it linked to this question of ethnocentrism, or are there other areas that you're looking at the moment?
I published a paper with a PhD student, Marcella Müller, and she's not finished yet. She's working on another topic with me, which is also interesting probably for the research notes. It's about the effects of a emotion, the emotion of envy not on donation behavior, but on volunteering behavior.
Interesting.
That's a research project. I have another one with another PhD student, which analyzes the effects of unethical board behavior in nonprofit organizations on the support of volunteers. That's another project I have right now. Yes, and some of the work is already submitted to journals, and some is ongoing.
Excellent. Well, they both sound very interesting, so we'll keep an eye out for those. Just remains to say thank you ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast and tell us about the research, and certainly look forward to hearing more in the future.
Yeah. Looking forward to this too. And thank you very much for having me in the podcast. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to all three guests for coming on the podcast, to Georg, to Joris, and to Georg. I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find the relevant research notes, and also links to the actual papers themselves if you want to sort of dig into some of the detail. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to listen to the previous episodes we've done in partnership with ERNOP and hear more about academic research on philanthropy in Europe, then do check those out. You can find them at the podcast website page, which is philanthropisms.org or philanthropisms.com, or you can also find all of those on the Why Philanthropy Matters website, where you can also find all kinds of great articles about things in philanthropy, both current and sort of longer term trends and issues. Also a lot of stuff about the history of philanthropy, the potential future of philanthropy, guides to all sorts of interesting aspects of philanthropy. Basically, just loads of philanthropy stuff. So go and spend a couple of days digging through that if that sounds like your bag. If you want to follow me on social media, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can probably find me in some other places as well, but you might get less of a response because I don't tend to spend very much time on those anymore. If you've got ideas for things we could talk about on the podcast or people that I could interview, do get in touch. I do get quite a lot of suggestions these days, and I follow up on as many of them as I possibly can, and many of them have led to interviewees and to some great episodes. Other than that, just please follow the podcast, subscribe to it, whatever it is people are supposed to tell you to do these days. If you're so minded, please do go on to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a nice 5-star review, because I think that helps bump us up the rankings and will hopefully help more people find the podcast who might be interested. If you know some actual humans in your life that you think might be interested, please do tell them about it, because word of mouth, as we've heard, is important when it comes to donations, but talking about charitable podcasts is also a very important way of getting people to comply with those solicitations, so please do that. Other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!